Signore e signori, buonasera, benvenuti a Tutti a Casa. Tutti a Casa is the live chat about all things Italian that Casa Italiana, zerilli-marimò at New York University and the Department of Italian Studies at New York University are offering to you to bring to your home while you are locked in, like all of us are, even if it seems like I'm in the Piazza del Duomo in Milan, fun, interesting, and engaging conversations that even if they start with things Italian, they can of course develop in much more. And we have the fortune to have here with us tonight as our special guest, Michael Moore. Michael is an interpreter. Actually, he's the senior translator for the Italian mission at the United Nations. So you can say that all Italian dignitaries, heads of states, heads of government have their voice through Michael when they speak English. And but he's also a very, very accomplished literary translation. I'm not going to give you the whole list of everybody that he has translated, but let's start with just Pope Benedict XVI among his other authors that he has handled until now. But tonight we are here to talk with Michael about Alessandro Manzoni. Alessandro Manzoni, who is one of the most revered, prominent, popular authors in Italian literature, almost completely forgotten and unknown in the United States, even in academic circles. Now, I wanted to start with Michael and asking him to say first something about Manzoni, whatever he wants to tell us to introduce, let's say, a virgin audience to Manzoni, and then to start talking about the reasons why he's not that popular in the US and why should he be. Michael.
Yes, hello, Stefano. It's a pleasure to speak with you. From New York to Milano, as the case may be. I spent many wonderful years in Milano and also drew the Duomo many times in my earlier career when I went to the Brera Academy. I get asked a lot by Americans what I'm working on, and when I say Manzoni, they kind of look puzzled. And the first thing I usually say to a cultivated audience is, well, do you know the Verdi Requiem? And they say, oh, of course. I said, well, that was written for Manzoni. And that is sort of startling piece of information to them. And, you know, I've tried to describe him in different ways, but I just say he was one of the great artist patriots of the 19th century. He wrote the great 19th century novel, which he invented modern literary Italian. I think he's, you cannot even begin to understand Italian literature, Italian narrative today without looking back at Manzoni. So he's very much a part of the Italian literary canon, the Italian literary standard, but he also is in the DNA, I think, of every Italian, since people are required to read and even memorize long passages of Manzoni from a very early age in the Italian school system. I also would say that people know Dante Alighieri very much in the United States and have for a while, and there are probably an average of 3 translations a year of Dante that come out. Whereas Manzoni, the last time this work was translated was 50 years ago. And he is to Italian prose what Dante is to Italian poetry. And he is every bit as encyclopedic and every bit as plurilinguistic, to sort of borrow a term from Italian philology. I mean, he uses many, many varieties of Italian, many registers, to communicate this great story.
The question I have for you is, it seems that in the United States right now, there is a lot of talk about Albert Camus. NPR ran a show on the plague, they interviewed professors, same thing in England on The Guardian. And it seems that he's basically the only author who has dealt with the issue of the plague that anybody can come up with. And there seems to be a complete blanket of oblivion on our poor Alessandro Manzoni. Why do you think specifically the chapters on the plague that actually you also generously made available, and they can be seen through a link on our website, why do you think these chapters on the plague in particular are relevant today? And why do you think it's a good idea to read them right now?
I think that it is, you could not find a more realistic and accurate epidemiological description of a plague, not only in terms of the way that it spreads, but the way that the public responds the way that the rulers respond, the way that it is managed by the people in charge, the superstitions that then come out. It's incredible the way Manzoni, writing in the 1820s, 30s about something that happened in 1630, so a good 200 years later, is so close to this and understands it so well, having read the documents. But I don't know, I keep wondering whether he had experienced some sort of plague himself, because he predicts so well and charts so well the emotional climate that surrounds a plague. Whereas Camus is a beautiful work. I like it very much, but I see it as much more metaphorical. Here we're in a very realistic realm. It is funny that from the beginning, these chapters provoked a kind of controversy. Goethe was very much against these chapters. He thought they were too documentary, and he thought it was the historian emerging rather than the poet. And I think instead, of course, that the beauty of Manzoni is how varied he is, and how he never goes too far in one direction. So he goes from this very careful examination of the documents to imagine what it was like on the skin, as the Italians might say, into full-blown dramatic episodes in the chapters that follow with lots of dialogue.
Since we prepared with the help of Julian and his technical support for you to read with the background of a great film from 1922, I think we should get into the reading. So we're going to have a chance to listen to your own translation of Manzoni on the plague. And what we're doing is basically, I'm going to explain to our viewers that you will be reading from your translation while we play on the background clips from the 1922 Mario Bonnard's film on the Promessi Sposi. It's a silent film that 12 years after it was released in 1934, was re-released with a soundtrack that was possible. But you will see, of course, from the exaggerated gestures and mimic, that it's definitely a silent movie made in the traditional way of silent films. So be patient, and some of the scenes that are supposed to be very dramatic and also in Michael's translation might almost be borderline comic because of this overacting of the silent movies. I don't want to give you an entire lecture on Mario Bonnard. Simply, he was a very prolific actor. He was the quintessential dandy. And then he turned to be a director, very successful, very prolific. He directed all sorts of films. An interesting factoid is that he started directing a film, and his last film was finished by Sergio Leone, the father of spaghetti Western. So it's from Manzoni to spaghetti Western through Mario Bonnard. And Michael, why don't you tell us something to introduce these chapters? So our hero or non-hero, Renzo Tramaglino, finds himself in Milan when the plague begins, and he immediately sees what you're about to read. The floor is all yours,
okay.
And of Mario Bonnard with the movie.
All right. Shall I just a very brief introduction? I mean, the plague was brought into Milan, and when we say Milan, we're talking about the whole Duchy of Milan, the whole state, from Como on down, when these German-speaking mercenaries, the Landsknechts, descended into Italy into this war for the succession of Mantua. They wanted to keep the French out of northern Italy, and so the Habsburg Empire sent its mercenaries down, and the mercenaries, in entering Lombardy, brought the plague with them. And this is a moment where this sort of feared event takes place. The plague that the health tribunal had feared might enter the Milan area with the German troops really did enter, as is well known. Just as it is well known that the plague did not stop there, but went on to invade and depopulate a good part of Italy. Throughout the strip of territory crossed by the army, dead bodies were found in houses and by the roadside. Not long after, in one town or another, individuals and whole families started to fall ill and die of strange, violent ailments with symptoms that most of the living had never seen before. At the beginning of a vast mortality, in which the victims cannot be identified by name but only vaguely indicated in the thousands, a strange curiosity rises to know the names of the first few carriers that can be recorded and conserved, as if the distinction of being the first to die in the extermination lends a fatal and memorable quality to the names and otherwise quite ordinary details. Two historians say that the first carrier of the plague was an Italian soldier in the service of Spain. This unfortunate foot soldier and bearer of misfortune, with a big bundle of clothing bought or stolen from German soldiers, stopped by the house of relatives. The moment he arrived, he fell ill and was taken to the hospital, where a dark, swollen lump of bubo was found under his armpit, leading his attendant to suspect the true cause. 4 days later, he died. The health tribunal ordered the isolation and quarantine of his relatives in their home. His clothing and hospital bed were burned. 2 servants and a good friar who had cared for him also fell ill in a matter of days. In the hospital, concerns about the nature of his illness were raised immediately, and precautions were taken as a result, preventing the contagion from spreading any further inside. But the soldier had sown a trail behind him that did not take long to germinate. The next to be infected was the landlord of the house where he had lodged. Therefore, on the orders of the health tribunal, all the tenants of the house were taken to the lazzaretto, the quarantine area built outside the city walls, where most of them fell ill and some died shortly thereafter with clear signs of the contagion. By then, the plague had already spread throughout the city, for the tenants' clothing and furniture was salvaged by relatives, neighbors, and servants from the search and burn instructions of the tribunal. There were also new arrivals to the city thanks to loopholes in the decrees, the lax application of them, and individuals who were deft at evading them. So the plague continued to fester and creep through the rest of the year and into the early months of 1630.
This was the introduction to the plague. And we said that, of course, Manzoni is a great observer of characters, of psychologies, of personalities, and of the human soul in general, how it changes, how it changes according to the situations that history puts it into. So what are the main consequences of the plague in society, according to Manzoni? What is that he notices that we can relate to in the situation in which we are?
There's, I think, probably what most Italians will know, there's a lot of scapegoating. I mean, there's this attempt to identify what we call, patient 0 today, or patient 1. And he talks about that in the case of this Italian soldier. So there is that. There is this attempt to shift the blame, saying that the plague came from outside. And indeed, it did come from outside in this case, but it is always seen as some kind of foreigner. And in that sense, it's kind of aligned with this whole foreign occupation of northern Italy by the Spanish in that period. And there is the war that occupies the Spanish rulers of Milan, which leads them to neglect the plague, which is unfortunately very similar to what is happening and what we're learning today in the United States, where our own executive branch has been very slow to respond and to recognize, first of all, and then to respond and prepare for this COVID-19 virus, which we see invading America at a very alarming rate. There are also heroes, I think, in the religious figures, the people who selflessly give of themselves, and very much like today, the heroes are the people who are working with the sick, who are risking their own lives in order to heal and to help and to maybe accompany into death those that are suffering from the plague. There is also in Manzoni something that I have noticed very much in translating the text, that there's a great attention to the reader. And so when he never goes too far in one direction. So after these chapters where he is documenting what has happened, you could see that he is very concerned that people might be becoming numb to this story. And then he interjects with the dramatic portion, which is the story of the mother of Cecilia, when Renzo, the hero, arrives in Milan and then observes this really heartbreaking scene, which many Italians know by heart, when the mother of this little girl, Cecilia, brings her body down to the death carts, which are dragged about the city by the so-called monati, these sort of ghoulish characters that are dragging away the sick and the dying and the dead.
Why don't you read us that scene? It's a memorable scene. There is normally not a dry eye in the classroom, even if you're teaching a fourth year high school, when that scene is read. And I'm really looking forward to you reading it over again, the footage of the Mario Bonard's film.
Descending from one of those doorways and walking toward the convoy came a woman whose appearance indicated a youth that was advanced but not yet past. She radiated a beauty that was shrouded and dimmed, but not ruined, by a great emotion and a fatal anger, the soft yet majestic beauty that runs in Lombard blood. Her gait was weary but not unsteady. Her eyes were dry but showed the sign of many tears. In her grief there was something placid and profound that attested to a soul fully aware of and alive to pain. But it was not her appearance alone amid so much misery that singled her out for pity and reawakened a feeling that in the human heart had become exhausted and numb. In her arms, she was holding the lifeless body of a little girl of about 9 years of age. The child had been lovingly dressed in a pure white garment, with her hair neatly parted on either side of her face, as if her mother's hands had prepared her for a long-promised celebration offered to her as a reward. She was held not prone but upright, seated on one arm, with her chest leaning against her mother's bosom, as if she were still alive, except for a pale and waxen little hand that dangled to one side with a kind of inanimate gravity. Her head rested on her mother's shoulder with an abandon more powerful than sleep, on her mother in such a way that although the likeness of their faces would not have betrayed it, clearly indicated which of the two was still capable of feeling. One of the loathsome monati came forward to remove the child from her arms, but with unusual deference, an almost involuntary hesitation. Taking a step back, yet without any sign of disrespect or contempt, "No, please don't touch her," she said. "I should be the one to place her on the cart." She opened her hand, revealing a purse, and dropped it into the outstretched palm of the monato. "This is for you," she said. "Now promise me you won't remove a stitch from her body," she added, "and to bury her in the ground exactly the way she is now." The monato placed a hand over his heart, and then, with the utmost care, almost obsequiously, more from the new sentiment that had overcome him than the unexpected compensation, set about making room on the cart for the lifeless girl. The mother, giving a kiss on the forehead, laid her down, as if on a bed, arranged her tenderly, and covered the body with a white sheet. She then uttered the final words, "Farewell, Cecilia. Rest in peace. Tonight we will join you, and we shall be together forever. Pray for us until that moment comes, and I will be praying for you and for the others." Turning once more to the monato, she said, "Sir, when you are passing by here toward evening, you will need to come upstairs to take me too, and not just me." At that, she went back inside the house and appeared at the window a moment later, holding another even younger girl in her arms. The child was still alive, though the signs of death were on her face. The mother stood contemplating the undignified funeral rites of her older daughter until the cart started to move and she could see it no more. Then she disappeared. And what else could she do but place on the bed her one remaining child and lie down next to her so they might die together? Just as a flower blooming on its stem and the unopened bud next to it fall with the same swipe of the scythe that levels all the grass in the field.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was beautiful, and I think it really worked very well with the film. when I said in one of the comments I put before the beginning of our chat, this is not going to be a chat, this is going to be a live performance. And it was, and I think it was very moving, and it was very, very well done. And your translation is beautiful. Somebody is asking me, why is the film in stop motion? It's not, it was shot, I believe, in 18 frames per second instead of the traditional 24 frames per second. So it might have to do with slow internet connections on our part, but it also has to do with the fact that it was shot with that ratio of frames per second. Still, it remains and is considered one of the colossal productions of Italian silent cinema. And there are some mass scenes, including the one that immediately precedes the one that we showed about the plague, the invasion of the German armies in Mantua, that are really massive with hundreds of extras and really colossal in production. And Bonnard studied and lived in Germany, so he's also very much influenced by German cinematography of the time. But going back to Cecilia, I read quite a long time ago an article by Adriano Sofri in which he establishes a connection between Cecilia and the little girl with the red coat in Schindler's List. And he wondered how Schindler would know about Manzoni, since nobody knows about Manzoni in the US. And then he was able to establish the connection. And of course, it's Primo Levi that you also translated. You translated some of his works for the complete works of Primo Levi, edited by Anne Goldstein. And I find that very, very impressive, the fact that in the Drowned and the Saved, I believe it's the English title, Levi talks about when they find themselves, and he finds himself recognizing one of the corpses as a kid he knew. And he makes immediately the connection with the mother of Cecilia. So when there are like masses of corpses is one thing. When you can put a name and a story behind it, it becomes a completely different thing. So when Manzoni is an historian, as you said, and gives numbers about the plague and explains it as a social phenomenon, many people find it boring and uninteresting because he's more of an historian than a poet. And with Cecilia, he demonstrates that, and the Madre di Cecilia, he can demonstrate that bringing you one single case of maternal grief in that sublime way in which he does it changes the entire game. And he does that, like, I would say, like nobody else, in a beautiful, beautiful way. Michael, what about politicians and the role that they had in the whole gestione, management of the emergency situation? What is that Manzoni tells us about them? Were they up to the bar? Were they up to standards? Were they incapable? Were they wise?
I think he's very critical of the of the Spanish, of the Habsburgs in Madrid, who were obsessed with Mantua and garrisoning an army in Lombardy, and to the detriment of the people. I mean, by the time the plague arrived, one of the reasons that it was so virulent was that the people had just been through a famine, so they were starving, so their immune systems were, as we would say today, their immune systems were down anyway. So this made things very worse. They were reluctant to accept that the plague was there. They put pressure. One of the great scenes, I have to admit, I was disappointed not to find it in Mario Bonnard's film, is the procession that the Archbishop Borromeo, Federico Borromeo, who founded the Ambrosian Library, so a great scholar and a great figure, and the nephew, by the way, of Carlo Borromeo, Saint Carlo Borromeo, who had been one of the great heroes of the previous plague in the 16th century. The people wanted a procession of the body of Carlo Borromeo, through thinking that somehow his sanctified remains would cure them of the plague. We see a little bit of this going on today, and it's kind of frightening. People talking about being bathed with the blood of Jesus will somehow protect them from COVID-19. But Borromeo caves into the pressure, and then this procession takes place. And of course, with all of the city out in the streets, the next day, the mortality and the infection rate just skyrockets.
Did it remind you of any contemporary politician, either on this side or on your side of the ocean?
Absolutely. The nameless one.
Go ahead.
I think that the way that the executive branch and that President Trump has sort of dithered as this virus has proceeded has really made things much worse and has created a climate of uncertainty and fear, which is already bad enough because of the way that this virus has struck everyone and brought our normal life and our economy and our society to a complete halt. I think there was a denial that the virus would arrive in America. There was this claim that it was just small, that it was foreign, that it was only a few cases. There was an attempt to carve out a kind of exemption for religion so that religious services could take place, very much like the procession that we see back, in Milan with the body of Carlo Borromeo. So things that from a purely medical or epidemiological point of view were very bad ideas were encouraged then, and they are being encouraged now. So there's been a very slow response, which has made the casualty list and the impact of this virus much, much worse than it needed to be.
Yeah, and you know that the leader of the Northern League here in Italy has actually asked that churches are reopened and everybody can go on Easter Sunday to seek refuge under the protection of the Virgin Mary. Of course, the bishops and the Pope are much wiser than he is, and are much more aware of the scientific aspect of the thing, or so it seems to be. So they're not caving in like Cardinal Federico Borromeo to the request of the Vicari del Consiglio Segreto, and
Yes.
They are sticking to what science dictates. One question about this, and of course you're right about Bonnard not doing that, but he doesn't go into great detail about the Monaca di Monza, for example. So it's a sort of purified version. It's cleaned up to make it more acceptable to the average Italian of the time, the average Catholic Italian of the time. So the scene of the procession that definitely Manzoni blames for spreading further the virus was a very conscious choice on the part of Bonnard to cut that, because it would have made clear, that there were responsibilities in accepting these pressures of the political authorities on the Cardinal Archbishop of Milan. Manzoni was a very devout Catholic. There is no doubt about that. And it comes up, even in the elegy, the Mother of Cecilia. It's a heartbreaking scene, but where there is an overlaying background of very solid, very strong faith. Do you think that Manzoni's stern Catholicism might be one of the reasons why he's not read, or he's not considered, or he's not studied in departments of Italian in the United States?
I've wondered about that.
I'm asking Michael, the translator, and Michael Moore, the Irish Catholic.
Yes, I mean, I was raised Catholic, just with, church every Sunday, sort of. I used to know the Gospels by heart and the various Stations of the Cross and the prayers. And it resonates with me. The language that was used, I would say, in the early 1960s, when I was going to church more, and also after Vatican II, which was a great moment, I would have to say, in the life of Catholicism in the world, and certainly Catholicism in America, and certainly from my parents. In looking at previous translations, I have the sense that they were done by Protestants and not by Catholics, because there is not that same attachment to the liturgical language that a Catholic might have. And there is not that sense of the kind of sermons that we Catholics might have heard. They're a little bit earthier. And with the Italian language, that's always a bit of an issue, which tends to be very abstract by nature. And when you're translating, you have to decide whether you're going to go high or whether you're going to go low, whether you're going to go abstract or whether you're going to go concrete. And it's not always clear, and you have to make that decision. In terms of American, I've heard I know that it is a puzzling question for Italianists and for Italians. Why is this novel not better known in America and in the world? Sometimes they think that it is because of the religious, content, because of this notion of providence. But as I once said to a famous Italian poet who said Americans will never understand Manzoni because they don't understand divine providence, I was born in a town called Providence. So it is puzzling. I mean, this is a country that was founded, the United States, by people who were fleeing from religious persecution. more deist, certainly, than the sense of religion that we have today, and probably anti-Catholic to the bone. And I think really, I mean, it's just only 1960 really with Kennedy's victory. It just seems like yesterday in a way, but that was very controversial because people were afraid of having a Catholic, thinking that a Catholic was always beholden to, the Pope in Rome. It's kind of a nonsensical point of view. Nevertheless, some people believe that. So I think some of the problem with that is definitely a religious issue. I think that their Italian departments are sent, as you know, are sandwiched together with the other Romance languages, which kind of muscle out Italian.
Not ours. We are freestanding and proud. As you
Very
know,
much so.
I mentioned, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Michael Moore holds a PhD in Italian studies from New York University with a doctoral dissertation on Francesco Petrarca.
Yes. And
So
when I began, it was a department.
At least that piece of information about you. Yeah.
Yes. But I also think the French have an advantage in promoting their literature in that they were united as a country and as a language much earlier than Italian, whereas Italians still today continue to debate the virtue of the Risorgimento, Italian unification. I mean, it's still very controversial and very fresh in a way that French unification is not, since it happened so much longer ago. And by reflex, it impacts the discussion of the Italian language itself. I mean, there is always some of the Italian authors that have been more successful abroad have been precisely the ones who were criticized in Italy because their Italian was not beautiful enough. I'm thinking in particular of Svevo and of Pirandello.
Yeah. Michael, we have a question from one of our viewers. Carlo Carlipso asked, which one is the character that warmed you the most? Your favorite character, the one that is dearest to you?
Oh, undoubtedly the Nun of Monza. I mean, I think apart from, I mean, I know that she's a bad guy. It is a remarkable portrait that Manzoni paints. I mean, I think the two characters that he describes most fully are the Nun of Monza and Padre Cristoforo. But with the Nun of Monza, he gives you an entire psychological portrait of the way this young girl is forced into the convent and creates a great deal of sympathy for her that even he himself was alarmed by, sort of wanting to cut short the story at a certain point. But it is such a fully realized version of a person's life from childhood into early adulthood. I mean, into her 20s, maybe early 30s, which is the time when Lucia first meets her. And you really understand the way that family pressure and society pressure was exerted on her, and the way that she really had no choice, and that any attempt at rebellion was immediately shut down in the most severe way possible. So I think that the chapters on the Monaca di Monza are really among the most modern things that Manzoni wrote. And Manzoni is a very modern author, I would add. I think that people might, especially Italians, having studied him in school, might think of him as old-fashioned. Not just in his time, but when we look at his prose and what he's doing, he's a remarkably avant-garde writer.
Yeah, absolutely. And regarding the Nun of Monza, actually, recently, especially some French critics of Manzoni came up with establishing connections between these figures, the Nun of Monza, the kidnapping of Lucia by the Innominato, and they connected them to the tradition of Sade. So of the pure girl imprisoned in a dungeon with very heavy sexual connotations that normally escape the normal.
Yes, I wouldn't connect it to Sade so much because not to criticize my French friends, but I mean, I think that the matrix of that is not French, but English. I think that the Gothic novels of Anne Radcliffe in particular, The Mysteries of Udolpho, are very much present in Manzoni's description of Lucia's imprisonment in the castle of the Nameless One. I've been sort of reading over those and finding many identical passages. I think that the landscape itself that is described, the kind of adjectives, kind of terror, it is a novel that Manzoni undoubtedly read. It was very popular. It was he probably read it in French, though. And it was hugely popular in Europe, The Mysteries of Udolpho, as well as the various novels that Anne Radcliffe wrote. But yes, it's very much like Sade, you know, and the novel shifts at that point into an entirely different mode. You know, as soon as you get into chapter 20, suddenly Lucia is in the castle of the Nameless One, and you are in a completely different world than the one you've inhabited up until that point. And this is what I mean when I talk about how endlessly varied Manzoni is in his language, in the registers that he uses, in his styles of storytelling. He always sort of he certainly kept me on edge as a translator. And I think that he keeps the attentive and patient reader on edge as well.
Wonderful. Michael, I think you have one more passage for us to read, and we probably are going to wrap it up with these third and last passage that you're going to read from our translation. And then I really want to finish with Manzoni's words in your translation without any comment after, so that I want to leave in our viewers, in our listeners, the sound of your language translating Manzoni for tonight. So I'm thanking you for your translation. It's an epic work to complete the translation of this little big book. And not only in Italian language or in Italian literature, it's really to understand the collective European consciousness that people need to read this novel today. And I would like to ask our viewers and listeners to tune in again with Tutti a Casa this coming Friday, 5 p.m. New York time, 11 p.m. Italian time. My guest is going to be Don Bruno Bignami, Father Bruno Bignami, who is the director of the Labor Office of the Italian Conference of Bishops, and he's also the postulator of the beatification cause for Father Mazzolari. Mazzolari was a country priest, anti-fascist, got into a lot of trouble with the church of his time, and this very morning, Pope Francis, during his homily from Santa Marta, talking about Judas and the great mystery of the treason of Judas, said, I don't need to get too much into it. Father Mazzolari talked about this much better than I can do. So we stir Judas, treason, and these reflections between this country priest who died in 1959 and Pope Francis today. So tune back in again with us on Tutti a Casa on Friday at 5 p.m. Michael, thank you again. And the floor and the microphones are yours for the last piece of your translation that you want to share with us. Thank you again.
This is just to frame this a little bit. This is the conclusion to chapter 32. Up until that point, people had been blaming the spread of the plague on these untori, these anointers who were supposedly spreading an unguent which contained the plague. And Manzoni is disputing this. There were still some, however, who believed right to the end and to the end of their lives that the unguents were pure fantasy. We know this not from them, since no one was brave enough to openly express an opinion that was so contrary to public opinion. We know it from writers who derided, criticized, or rejected this belief as a prejudice of some, an error that did not dare broach open controversy, but that still persisted. We also know it from people who had the story handed down to them. I have come across people in Milan, writes the good Muratori, who had received reliable reports from their ancestors and were not persuaded that these poisonous unguents existed. We can see that there was a clandestine outlet for the truth, a family secret. Good sense did indeed exist, but it stayed hidden for fear of common sense.